Given the relationship between individual difference characteristics and performance, assessment is an important part of the selection decision. Understanding assessment methods requires thinking about both the content, or what is being measured, and the process, or how it's being measured. Before I go into much detail, it might be helpful to explain what assessment means. You probably got the idea from the context and the reading, but I find it can be helpful to stop and think about ideas like this directly. One reason it's helpful is because we use the term in two slightly different ways. In some contexts, we use the word assessment to describe a test or other type of measures that are used to determine an individual's level of a particular individual difference characteristic or where they land on a construct. For example, we use assessments to determine whether a person has the characteristics necessary for a job, and we use assessments to measure stress. Those tests and measures are based on psychometric evidence, which is a fancy way of saying they've been studied to make sure they're reliable and they're valid. Yes, there's an entire field of study and people whose life work is researching how to measure psychological characteristics. Another way we use the word assessment is to refer to a process of combining data to evaluate or to assess a person. The process typically uses established tests or other types of measures. Our book talks about using a test battery, which would fit with this idea of assessment. Given the context that assessments are performed, like in selecting employees or making a clinical diagnosis, it's important to have reliable and valid processes. But using a combination of data means that the specific psychometrics are more difficult to determine. One type of assessment is a test, an objective and standardized measure, like a multiple choice quiz and exam you take for class. Tests can be used for a wide range of individual difference characteristics, though, and for a combination of characteristics, like those represented by integrity or situational judgment. Tests can be administered in a number of ways. Your book talks about the different options, but one thing that might be particularly surprising is the performance test. It might be the one we think is the most different from what we think of when we think of a test. Note, too, that paper and pencil could mean on the computer. It only differentiates between the idea of performance and in writing, really. Cognitive ability is one category of individual differences that can be tested, and is frequently tested, in the hiring process. Some tests provide a single score representing what the individual knows, perceives, remembers, understands, and/or can do mentally. The NFL actually uses a single score cognitive ability test, the Wonderlic, in staffing. Other tests measure specific abilities, like spatial reasoning. The procedures can emphasize either speed or power. An assessment for selection is not uncommon for the assessment to be paper-based that can be administered to a group, which, like I said a minute ago, could also mean it's on a computer. It's just not a performance test. That's more efficient than the other options. That said, in the selections for higher level positions, individual tests and performance tests are also used, or group performance tests, like those included in an assessment center. Physical abilities can also be tested. The book uses this example of the requirements for a firefighter and how they can be tested. We can make a case that physical abilities might be the easiest to measure. If we can identify a work sample requiring physical ability, we have a way to measure it. Despite how intuitive it might seem, or maybe because of it, it's important to be cautious in selecting physical ability tests. They're also a good example of how a test can be valid, but not a valid measure of the requirements for the job. Firefighter selection is a good example of that. Female candidates have questioned whether the job really requires the extent of physical ability tested by some measures, because the requirement is biased against typical physiological abilities of females. For example, requirements for carrying hoses up flights of stairs can be questioned if it's unusual to need to move a hose that distance, given available equipment or the typical structures in the area. It might have already occurred to you that there are some types of characteristics that don't have a right or wrong, like personality. We can still measure or assess those characteristics. We just don't use the term test when talking about the measure. Or it's not exactly accurate to do so. Personality measures can also be grouped into two categories. The book calls them screen in and screen out, which is a little tricky for me to wrap my head around. Here's the idea though. We know that some personality characteristics are related to variations in performance. So a valid measure of those characteristics can be a valid way to differentiate between candidates for a job. When we're measuring those characteristics for a purpose like that, we're doing what's called screening in, screening candidates to see if they remain in the group of people we're considering. Measures of personality traits are also less likely to have an adverse impact against some groups. When we consider that, and the fact that it can be related to performance, personality measures can be highly valid for differentiating between candidates. Other measures, though, provide information that would be considered a diagnosis of mental illness or of pathology. Since the Americans with Disabilities Act prevents discrimination in employment, the results of those tests can't be used to differentiate among candidates. That doesn't mean they can't be taken into consideration, though. They can be used to screen out a potential employee who would not be able to perform the job, even with accommodations, because of the nature of the job and the nature of the results. In those cases, though, they are not being compared to other applicants, only to job requirements. Biographical data is another form of information that isn't objectively right or wrong. We could probably make a good case it's also one of the most common forms of information used in selection. Biographical data is the term we use for the information contained in applications or on resumes. Looking at that information is based on what we call the ecological model, which is the theory that an individual's history represents choices and signals their abilities, interests, and personality. There's some degree of logic to that, but you can probably think about a few weaknesses in that thinking too. For example, being laid off is not typically a choice, but it could result in a gap in work history. Biographical data might not be a valid measure of the characteristics needed for the role, too. For example, a recent college graduate might have a high GPA and strong letters of recommendation, but not be successful at a job. In fact, research suggests GPA and recommendations alone don't tend to predict job success. Considerations like that are part of the reason that biographical data is often used as a first step to establish that someone has the minimum qualifications for a job. You might have the idea that psychometricians have found a way to measure almost any individual difference characteristic that might be job relevant. And that's probably an accurate idea. As with other things though, just because we can measure it doesn't mean we should. If we do determine characteristic is relevant to the job, we often have options for the specific method, specific structure, and the method of administering the measure.